Tonight, we're hearing from the former transit police officer who shot and killed an unarmed African-American man in 2009 and who just yesterday avoided a guilty verdict on the most serious charge against him. Johannes Messerly was found guilty yesterday of involuntary manslaughter instead of the more serious charge of second-degree murder for shooting 22-year-old Oscar Grant in the back on a train platform in Oakland, California last year. Messerly's lawyer released a statement today, handwritten by Messerly himself, which read in part, quote, "I have and will continue to live every day of my life knowing that Mr. Grant should not have been shot. It saddens me knowing that my actions cost Mr. Grant his life." Messerly has said he didn't mean to shoot Oscar Grant. He testified in court that he thought he had reached for and was firing his taser and not his sidearm. Of course, much of the incident was caught on camera by onlookers at the train station. That's the video you're seeing here. Transit police had, at this point, detained Oscar Grant and 4 others on the platform after responding to reports of a fight on the train. At the moment when Johannes Messerly pulls his gun out of its holster, stands up and shoots Oscar Grant in the back, Grant was lying face down on the ground with another officer's knee pressed against his neck. Needless to say, especially given the existence of that video, a lot of people are outraged with a conviction of involuntary manslaughter and not murder. Police in Oakland made around 80 arrests in the protests that followed the announcement of the verdict, but fears of violence and rioting were the exception to the mostly peaceful demonstrations. Speaking outside the courtroom just after the verdict was handed down, Oscar Grant's uncle enunciated the much larger problem that his nephew's shooting death is a very small but tragic part of.
This wasn't just Oscar Grant's murder. This is for all the murders that's been committed on young black men for a long time. So they don't want to change what's been going on, what they've been doing. They haven't changed today. So all we can do is hope that the next family, or should I say the next black family that goes through this, have enough strength, like my little sister, like my brother, to fight it all the way to the end.
The big problem here is the relationship between police and African Americans, particularly young African American men in this country. Even if you're just looking at the Oscar Grant shooting in isolation, and even if you believe Johannes Messerly's defense that he thought he was pulling out his taser instead of his gun, just look at what happened before the shooting. Look at this scene. Look at what this confrontation was like, even before it became a deadly shooting. The fact is, for every incident like this, there are thousands and tens of thousands of incidents that look just like it, except for the shooting at the end. In other words, not tragic, but still humiliating and acrimonious. And if you're not a young black or Latino man in this country, the odds are this just doesn't happen to you. Aside from being an example of injustice in pure form, someone being killed for nothing, what happened to Oscar Grant was an example of the cost of the routinization of police confrontations with communities of color in this country. A 2007 investigation of fatal police shootings in the country's 10 largest cities, conducted by Color Lines and the Chicago Reporter, found African Americans were overrepresented among police shooting victims in every city they investigated. A 2007 study by the nonprofit RAND Corporation found that African Americans and Hispanics in New York City were more likely to be frisked, searched, or arrested than whites. A study released earlier this year found that race even plays a role in mistaken identity police-on-police shootings, with officers of color increasingly the ones being killed by other officers who mistake them for criminals. Joining us now is Jakada Imani, Executive Director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. Jakada, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
The Justice Department announced today that its Civil Rights Division will review the Oscar Grant shooting. I'm wondering what you make of that, what in practical terms that means for this case.
It means there's still hope of justice. You know, in California, we're used to seeing these kind of cases. I think all around the country, where DAs and police officers who traditionally work very close together, DAs have a very difficult time getting convictions on cops. And so we sadly know these kind of things happen, and it's the federal government that can stand up for Americans, regardless of race, color, or creed, and demand justice. And so we think that's a very important step. In fact, on our website at the ellabakercenter.org, there's a place where your viewers can go, or anybody can go and email the Attorney General's office and tell them that to stand with Oscar Grant's family and to stand with all the victims of police brutality around the country.
it's interesting you bring up the sort of difficulty of the convictions. We were looking through this data yesterday. Los Angeles prosecutors have not won a murder conviction against a police officer since 1983. Do you? I guess I'm asking. Do you think these are prosecuted in good faith and they're difficult to convict because of the juries? Are you saying that the convictions aren't pursued with the same kind of zeal and vigor as other prosecutions?
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue. I think there's a number of factors. One is jurors are really hesitant to believe that people who are hired to protect and serve our communities would use their authority under the color of law to abuse everyday other citizens. Such to the fact that in this case, in the case of Oscar Grant, where, you know, there's dozens and dozens of witnesses, video from 4 different angles, you know, if any other incident where on any corner in America you saw a man shoot another man who was laying on the ground in the back, you would charge that as murder and that person would be convicted and spend a long time in prison. But jurors disbelieved their own eyes because that man wore a blue uniform, was a white officer shooting a black man, and so therefore the trial became as much about Johannes Meserly's action as the life Oscar Grant had lived up until now. What grades did he get in the 6th grade? What kind of father was he? As opposed to the actions that led to this innocent man losing his life on that BART platform.
Yeah, I want to talk about the actions that led up even before the shooting, because to me, in some ways, that it sort of captures so much of what's fraught about the relationships between communities of color and police officers.
Yeah.
What do you make of that scene? Because that scene to me, I've seen that scene a lot, and it was very confrontational and very aggressive. And I think that people don't necessarily have a sense of what it's like to be on the other side of that if they haven't been in that position. How typical was that scene from the experience you've had in Oakland and the people you work with through the Ella Baker Center?
Yeah. Well, sadly, that scene is so typical in the experience of young men of color throughout this country. That, you know, police officers arrive on the scene and they're escalating instantly, right? There's the yelling at you to get down on the ground, to move away. They're putting their hands on their guns or their tasers. They're rushing up on them, putting their hands on you instantly. Oftentimes, we even have any idea who they are or what they want. What was remarkable about this case was how many witnesses were there. Yeah. What was remarkable about this case was how instantly it was on the internet because folks had their cell phones there and were able to record it. What was remarkable about this case was this officer was actually charged with murder. Please.
Yeah, you mentioned the tasers, and since we have a little bit of time, I want to ask you about that, because obviously that was the nature of the defense, but I can't but help think, why are we equipping police officers with tasers and guns that look at all alike, first of all, and second of all, we have seen an epidemic of a lot of questionably justified tasing, and I wonder if that's an issue that you're seeing as well, what you make of that.
Yeah, well, we're concerned that even the idea that a man laying on his stomach, laying on his back, excuse me, with 2 officers on him, somehow it was reasonable to pull out a taser. What we were told when tasers came into use was that these are less than lethal weapons, and they're going to mean that there's less confrontations. And what we've seen, I think what the data shows, is that police are now quick to tase and ask questions later. The UN came out in 2007 and said these are actually weapons of torture that can kill. And police departments are still using them as this idea of less than lethal, and we think they're sometimes lethal. But we have too many toys and too many weapons, and not enough reason, not enough logic, not enough de-escalation and talking to people and actually solving problems. Yeah. And we think that's a huge problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that we can revisit the taser issue perhaps with you again, because I think that's a really important story. Jakada Imani, Executive Director of the Ella Baker Center, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for covering it, Chris. Thank you for covering this.
Coming up, a 2010 Republican campaign video guaranteed to appeal to young voters in 1985. Word to your mother. Stick around.